All right, thank you guys. So today will be our last Sunday school in the Chesterton series. We've been looking at excerpts of his work. Many of you have not read G.K. Chesterton previously. Some of you have, but he's an author that's had a profound influence on my life, and so you'll hear him referenced a lot. And so I'm hoping that this is encouraging you to read Chesterton a little bit more. I told you last week that if we only had 1 week left in this series, as it turns out we do, that I wanted to share with you some of what Chesterton had to say about education. I've given you a longer handout that we're going to be able to cover today, and even what I've given you has been significantly cut down. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share with you a part of one section in one of Chesterton's books, What's Wrong with the World. Section 4 is on education, or the mistake about a child. The first two sections within this section, right, the first two short chapters, are part of Chesterton's critique against Calvinism. I would love to go through that with you and talk to you about the good, the bad, and the ugly of his critique of Calvinism. I've mentioned before that Chesterton, while he was very critical of Calvinism, generally speaking, he is critiquing a version of Calvinism that all of us should be willing to join in critiquing. He, at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century in the United Kingdom, is seeing a very emaciated, decayed version of Puritanism that has just become silly and has been hollowed out of true biblical life and joy. Now, that being said, sometimes Chesterton still does straw man Calvinists, and we would not join in that type of critique. But overall, I think Chesterton's observations and commentary on that kind of thing can be very useful in kind of examining our own tradition and making sure that we are not falling into some of the errors that he's observing. But I really want to focus on, instead, the section this unit is largely focused upon, and that is the topic of education. Chesterton was a real critic of what we would think of as state-sponsored public education today. Now, you'll see in this section that we're looking at, he doesn't exclude the possibility of public education. He just argues that it is it's based on completely the wrong foundation, and it's being practiced in completely destructive ways. I think if Chesterton had lived several decades later, he would have been a huge proponent of Christian schools and homeschooling, because you can see in kind of his theory and his fundamental philosophy that it would align very well with those movements that we subscribe to. All right, again, I've given you more than we're going to be able to cover, and I've cut down even what I've given you. If you want to get this book, it's readily available online. All of Chesterton's work is in the public domain. That doesn't mean it's all available just because there's so much of it, but anything that he wrote is beyond copyright. You can find this on a number of different websites, and the entire book is very edifying. It's got a great section against feminism as well, if you like that kind of thing. I will tell you, this work in general, What's Wrong with the World, and this section, part 4 of it, is a little bit more difficult for some people to follow, because as I told you in the introduction to this series, Chesterton's work is more historically situated than someone like C.S. Lewis. He will make more frequent references to contemporaries and to contemporary debates that are far removed from us, because we don't live in the UK and because we also live on this side of World War II. Chesterton is talking about the pre-war period, pre-World War I, and then the post-World War I world. And that's so far removed from us historically and culturally that sometimes those things are difficult to follow, but I'll try to make it as easy as I can as we go through. All right, we're going to start here in part 4. This is chapter 4 of part 4, The Truth About Education. When a man is asked to write down what he really thinks on education, a certain gravity grips and stiffens his soul, which might be mistaken by the superficial for disgust. If it be really true that men sickened of sacred words and wearied of theology, if this largely unreasoning irritation against dogma did arise out of some ridiculous excess of such things among priests in the past, then I fancy we must be laying up a fine crop of cant for our descendants to grow tired of. Probably the word education will someday seem honestly as old and objectless as the word justification now seems in a Puritan folio. Gibbon thought it frightfully funny that people should have thought about the difference between the homoousion and the homoi or homiousion. The time will come when somebody will laugh louder to think that men thundered against sectarian education and also against secular education. That men of prominence and position actually denounced the schools for teaching a creed and also for not teaching a faith. The two Greek words in Gibbon look rather alike, but they really mean quite different things. Faith and creed do not look alike, but they mean exactly the same thing. Creed happens to be the Latin for faith. All right, now, that first paragraph you may have trouble following, so let me take a step back and make sure that you understand how he's setting the table here. He's saying that right now there is a debate between secular education and sectarian education. And then he refers to Edward Gibbon, who wrote The Rise and Decline of the Roman Empire, or The Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire. And Gibbon is a notorious secularist. He is a hostile antagonist against the Christian faith. And he thinks it's absolutely absurd that in the early church there was this debate between homoousion or homiousion. But that little iota made all the difference. It made all the difference between those who were theologically orthodox with regard to the doctrine of Christ and those who were Arians. That one little letter made all the difference. And Chesterton is saying it may seem like this is a silly debate, but actually it's a very significant debate. And sometimes the way the debate is being framed is the problem. He says the words faith and creed don't look anything alike, whereas these two words from the early church, they look a lot alike. What's the big deal? These words don't look anything alike, but they mean exactly the same thing. And he's going to argue that there is no such thing as secular education. And to the extent that there is anything like secular education, it's destructive, not edifying. And he goes on. Now, having read numberless newspaper articles on education, and even written a good many of them, and having heard deafening and indeterminate discussion going on all around me almost ever since I was born about whether religion was part of education, about whether hygiene was an essential of education, about whether militarism was inconsistent with true education, I naturally pondered much on this recurring substantive, and I am ashamed to say that it was comparatively late in life that I saw the main fact about it. Of course, the main fact about education is that there is no such thing. It does not exist as theology or soldiering exist. Theology is a word like geology. Soldiering is a word like soldering. These sciences may be healthy or no as hobbies, but they deal with stone and kettles with definite things. But education is not a word like geology or kettles. Education is a word like transmission or inheritance. It is not an object, but a method. It must mean the conveying of certain facts, views, or qualities to the last baby born. They might be the most trivial facts, or the most preposterous views, or the most offensive qualities. But if they are handed on from one generation to another, they are education. Education is not a thing like theology. It is not an inferior or superior thing. It is not a thing in the same category of terms. Theology and education are to each other like a love letter to the General Post Office. Mr. Fagin, here you have to know your Dickens, Mr. Fagin was quite as educational as Dr. Strong. In practice, probably more educational. It is giving something, perhaps poison. Education is tradition. And tradition, as its name implies, can be treason. Now you understand the reference to Fagin and Strong, right? From Dickens. One is the corrupter of youth. The other is the savior and educator of youth. But Chesterton is pointing out Fagin was educating more youth and maybe more effectively than Dr. Strong ever did or could. This first truth is frankly banal, but it is so perpetually ignored in our political prosing that it must be made plain. A little boy in a little house, son of a little tradesman, is taught to eat his breakfast, to take his medicine, to love his country, to say his prayers, and to wear his Sunday clothes. Obviously, Fagin, if he found such a boy, would teach him to drink gin, to lie, to betray his country, to blaspheme, and to wear false whiskers. But so also Mr. Salt, the vegetarian, would abolish the boy's breakfast. Mrs. Eddy would throw away his medicine. Count Tolstoy would rebuke him for loving his country. Mr. Blatchford would stop his prayers, and Mr. Edward Carpenter would theoretically denounce Sunday clothes, and perhaps all clothes. I do not defend any of these advanced views, not even Fagin's, but I do ask what, between the lot of them, has become of the abstract entity called education. It is not, as commonly supposed, that the tradesman teaches education plus Christianity, Mr. Salt, education plus vegetarianism, Fagin, education plus crime. The truth is that there is nothing in common at all between these teachers except that they teach. In short, the only thing they share is the one thing they profess to dislike, the general idea of authority. It is quaint that people talk of separating dogma from education. Dogma is actually the only thing that cannot be separated from education. It is education. A teacher who is not dogmatic is simply a teacher who is not teaching. Are you following his argument now? You have all of these radicals, all of these social revolutionaries who are opposed to authority, who are opposed to tradition, who are opposed to religion, who are opposed to any kind of dogmatism, and they are very dogmatically opposed. And what he's arguing is that there is no such thing as education as an object. Education is whatever is being handed down, whatever you are teaching, or in the case of the child, being taught. And therefore there is no possibility of a non-dogmatic education. Or, Van Til might say, there's no neutrality. You cannot say, we're going to educate these children in a creed-less, non-dogmatic, neutral way or space. Not possible. Not possible. Chesterton is saying this 100 years ago. We go on to the next section, an evil cry. The fashionable fallacy is that by education we can give people something that we have not got. To hear people talk, one would think it is some sort of magic chemistry, by which out of a laborious hodgepodge of hygienic mills, baths, breathing exercises, fresh air, and freehand drawing, we can produce something splendid by accident. We can create what we cannot conceive. These pages have, of course, no other general purpose than to point out that we cannot create anything good until we have conceived it. It is odd that these people, who in the matter of heredity are so sullenly attached to law, in the matter of environment seem almost to believe in miracle. They insist that nothing but what was in the bodies of the parents can go to make the bodies of the children, but they seem somehow to think that things can get into the heads of the children which were not in the heads of the parents, or indeed anywhere else. He's saying they are denying reality. They understand that children do not spontaneously generate. They don't appear out of the ether. They are produced when a man and a woman come together and conceive. And he's saying education cannot just appear out of the ether. You can't just create this kind of environment and suddenly the child becomes something that the parents never could have conceived of. In other words, what Chesterton is saying in a very poetic way is that you cannot teach what you do not know. And you can't pass on what you do not have. You cannot teach what you do not know. You cannot pass on what you do not have. There is arisen in this connection a foolish and wicked cry typical of the confusion. I mean the cry, save the children. It is, of course, part of that modern morbidity that insists on treating the state, which is the home of man, as a sort of desperate expedient in time of panic. This terrified opportunism is also the origin of the socialist and other schemes. Just as they would collect and share all the food, as men do in a famine, so they would divide the children from their fathers, as men do in a shipwreck. That a human community might conceivably not be in a condition of famine or shipwreck never seems to cross their minds. This cry of save the children has in it the hateful implication that it is impossible to save the fathers. In other words, that many millions of grown-up, sane, responsible, and self-supporting Europeans are to be treated as dirt or debris and swept away out of the discussion, called dipsomaniacs because they drink in public houses instead of private houses, called unemployables because nobody knows how to get them to work, called dullards if they still adhere to conventions, and called loafers if they still love liberty. They are deplorables. Now, I am concerned, first and last, to maintain that unless you can save the fathers, you cannot save the children. That at present we cannot save others, for we cannot save ourselves. We cannot teach citizenship if we are not citizens. We cannot free others if we have forgotten the appetite of freedom. Education is only truth in a state of transmission. And how can we pass on truth if it has never come into our hand? Thus we find that education is of all the cases the clearest for our general purpose. It is vain to save children, for they cannot remain children. By hypothesis, we are teaching them to be men. And how can it be so simple to teach an ideal manhood to others if it is so vain and hopeless to find one for ourselves? What do weak, broken, morally compromised men and women produce? They produce weak, broken, compromised generations. And he's going back to this idea that we've encountered already several times in him, and especially in his critique with regard to the family, of this socialist and Marxist idea that the state can take the place of the family. That what we do is we take the children away from the parents because the parents are obviously idiots, and the state is going to do what they do so much better. But he says we are not in a time of famine where we all need to be sharing our food. We're not in a time of shipwreck where you need to hand your children off to someone in order to save them from the boat that is sinking. And the state, as he's argued in previous weeks, cannot do what only the family can do. I know that certain crazy pedants have attempted to counter this difficulty by maintaining that education is not instruction at all, does not teach by authority at all. You've heard of this, like the unschooling movement. This idea that we can educate children by not giving them any structure whatsoever because we don't want to teach them what to believe. We don't want to hamper their creativity. We don't want to, impede their personal development. They present the process as coming not from the outside, from the teacher, but entirely from inside the boy. Education, they say, is the Latin for leading out, or drawing out the dormant faculties of each person. Somewhere far down in the dim boyish soul is a primordial yearning to learn Greek accents. Well, it wasn't mine. Or to wear clean collars. And the schoolmaster only gently and tenderly liberates this imprisoned purpose. Sealed up in the newborn babe are the intrinsic secrets of how to eat asparagus. And what was the date of Bannockburn? The educator only draws out the child's own unapparent love of long division, only leads out the child's slightly veiled preference for milk pudding to tarts. I am not sure that I believe in the derivation. I have heard the disgraceful suggestion that educator, if applied to a Roman schoolmaster, did not mean leading our young functions into freedom, but only meant taking out little boys for a walk. But I am much more certain that I do not agree with the doctrine. I think it would be about as sane to say that the baby's milk comes from the baby as to say that the baby's educational merits do. There is indeed in each living creature a collection of forces and functions, but education means producing these in particular shapes and training them to particular purposes, or it means nothing at all. Speaking is the most practical instance of the whole situation. You may indeed draw out squeals and grunts from the child by simply poking him and pulling him about, a pleasant but cruel pastime, in which many psychologists are addicted. But you will wait and watch very patiently indeed before you draw the English language out of him. That you have got to put into him, and there is an end of the matter. Now, you might be interested to know that in ancient Greek philosophy, there was this idea that education, it really involves simply drawing out what was already in man, because man had been reincarnated. And because man, because of prior existences, prior lifetimes, already had all of the knowledge within himself, right? Some of the Platonic dialogues are about this, Meno particularly, right? And it's simply not true. It's simply false. It doesn't matter if it's an idiotic thing that someone said a long time ago, it's still idiotic. And Chesterton is pointing that out. He says, well, the Latin root of education means to lead out. I'm doubtful of the derivation. Regardless, I deny the doctrine that they are inferring from it. This is an etymological error. If you think, well, because education is taken from a Latin word that means to lead out, everything that the child could potentially know, they already know. You just simply have to extract it. It's just not true. It's just not true. What language did you speak to your children in when they were babies? That's the language that they speak today. I tried to talk to my children in other languages, right? But they didn't learn any of those languages because I didn't speak to them enough in it. The reality is truth has to be transmitted. And the same way that a mother has to breastfeed her child, a father has to teach his son what he needs to know. There's simply no other way. And so he goes on to discuss authority, the unavoidable. But the important point here is only that you cannot anyhow get rid of authority in education. It is not so much, as poor conservatives say, that parental authority ought to be preserved as that it cannot be destroyed. There's going to be a father figure who educates the child. The question is whether it's going to be the parents or Fagin. That's what he's saying. It's not just, as the conservatives, the mild conservatives in the UK were saying, is, well, we need to preserve parental authority. He says, preserve it? Forget about that. You can't destroy parental authority. You've got to fight against the socialists that are saying the state should be the parent. You're going to have a parent. You're going to have a strong man. You're going to have an educator. The question is whether the educator is going to transmit truth. Mr. Bernard Shaw once said that he hated the idea of forming a child's mind. In that case, Mr. Bernard Shaw had better hang himself, for he hates something inseparable from human life. Chesterton. I love him. I only mentioned educare and the drawing out of the faculties in order to point out that even this mental trick does not avoid the inevitable idea of parental or scholastic authority. The educator drawing out is just as arbitrary and coercive as the instructor pouring in, for he draws out what he chooses. He decides what in the child shall be developed and what shall not be developed. He does not, I suppose, draw out the neglected faculty of forgery. He does not, so far at least, lead out with timid steps a shy talent for torture. No, actually what they're drawing out is some latent gender confusion by which public school teachers can convince your child that they actually belong to the opposite sex. There's an example of trying to draw something out. They're drawing out what they want, and they're actually suggesting it. They're putting it in. The only result of all this pompous and precise distinction between the educator and the instructor is that the educator pokes where he likes, and the educator pulls where he likes. Exactly the same intellectual violence is done to the creature who is poked and pulled. Now, we must all accept the responsibility of this intellectual violence. Education is violent because it is creative. It is creative because it is human. It is as reckless as playing on the fiddle, as dogmatic as drawing a picture, as brutal as building a house. In short, it is what all human action is. It is an interference with life and growth. After that, it is a trifling and even a jocular question whether we say of this tremendous tormentor, the artist man, that he put things into us like an apothecary or draws things out of us like a dentist. He's saying you're arguing about something that doesn't make any difference. Oh, we need educators, not instructors. We don't want to shape the child's mind. We want to draw out of the child's mind. He says the reality is, even if you were to adopt that particular point of view, you are simply doing the same kind of authoritative instruction that the instructor, the dogmatic instructor that you so oppose, is also doing. It doesn't matter whether you're poking or you're pulling. It doesn't matter whether you're an apothecary or a dentist. The reality is, any act of education is violent. Any act of human involvement and engagement is interference, right? So think about planting a garden. When you plant a garden, what do? You rip up the ground. You reshape the garden bed. You put in it what you want to grow. You take out of it everything that you don't want to grow. You say grow in this way and not in that way. It's a violent, coercive act. And so is all human engagement. By the way, since we're going to get to this later next month, right? Next Sunday's Reformation Sunday, so we won't be in Genesis for 1 week. But next month, when we finish up Genesis chapter 2, how exactly does God make woman? He kills man and He tears him open. He puts Adam in a death sleep. He tears open his side so that out of his side can come the bride. Same with Jesus on the cross. So it's violent because it's human. It's violent because man is made in the image of God. The point is that man does what he likes. He claims the right to take his mother nature under his control. He claims the right to make his child the Superman in his image. One flinch from this creative authority of man, and the whole courageous raid, which we call civilization, wavers and falls to pieces. Now, most modern freedom is at root fear. It is not so much that we are too bold to endure rules, it is rather that we are too timid to endure responsibilities. Now, every dad needs to highlight, copy down, probably post that somewhere in your house, but certainly communicate it to your sons. It is not that we are too bold to endure rules, it is rather that we are too timid to endure responsibilities. That's the issue. Your sons, when tempted to defy your authority and color outside the lines of your house, it is not that they are too bold to follow the rules, it is that they are too timid to endure responsibilities. And they need to be taught to man up. You need to be faithful. You need to be courageous. You need to be brave and bold. Brave and bold does not look like acting like a criminal, acting like a transgressor. It means shouldering responsibility like a man. Mr. Shaw and such people are especially shrinking from that awful and ancestral responsibility to which our fathers committed us when they took the wild step of becoming men. I mean the responsibility of affirming the truth of our human tradition and handing it on with a voice of authority, an unshaken voice. You don't timidly suggest to your children things that they might want someday to believe. You tell them what the truth is. You tell them the truth. If my children choose not to brush their teeth after they move out of my house, that's on them. But they're brushing their teeth as long as they're in my home. And they're going to church. And they're saying their prayers. They're learning the catechism. They're doing their chores. They're following the rules. Because that's what it means to be a responsible human person. It's an unshaken voice. That is the one eternal education. To be sure enough that something is true that you dare to tell it to a child. From this high, audacious duty, the moderns are fleeing on every side. And the only excuse for them is, of course, that their modern philosophies are so half-baked and hypothetical that they cannot convince themselves enough to convince even a newborn babe. This, of course, is connected with the decay of democracy and is somewhat of a separate subject. To suffice it to say here that when I say that we should instruct our children, I mean that we should do it, not that Mr. Sully or Professor Earl Barnes should do it. The trouble in too many of our modern schools is that the state, being controlled so specially by the few, allows cranks and experiments to go straight to the schoolroom when they have never passed through the parliament, the public house, the private house, the church, or the marketplace. Oh, that's so true. I am really tempted to follow a rabbit trail here for just a moment, but I don't have time. You put in positions of teaching responsibility people who have never shown them faithful or productive as human beings. And that is as true in the church as it is anywhere else. And you should not be content with that kind of leadership in the church. Obviously, it ought to be the oldest things that are taught to the youngest people. Did you see that? The oldest things, obviously. It ought to be the oldest things that are taught to the youngest people. Because it's the oldest things that you're most certain of. It's not new ideas. Discuss new ideas among yourselves. Teach old truths to your children. The assured and experienced truths that are put first to the baby. But in a school today, the baby has to submit to a system that is younger than himself. The flopping infant of 4 actually has more experience and has weathered the world longer than the dogma to which he is made to submit. Many a school boasts of having the last ideas in education, when it has not even the first idea. For the first idea is that even innocence, divine as it is, may learn something from experience. But this, as I say, is all due to the mere fact that we are managed by a little oligarchy. My system presupposes that men who govern themselves will govern their children. Today, we all use popular education as meaning education of the people. I wish I could use it as meaning education by the people. Who do you want teaching your children? Well, you're supposed to teach your children. And that is your responsibility, whether you send your children to a public school or a charter school or a private Christian school or you homeschool. It's your job to teach your children. You cannot outsource it. You cannot abdicate it. And if you have, you need to repent of that today and start taking responsibility. The urgent point at present is that these expansive educators do not avoid the violence of authority an inch more than the old schoolmasters. Nay, it might be maintained that they avoid it less. The old village schoolmaster beat a boy for not learning grammar and sent him out into the playground to play anything he liked, or at nothing if he liked that better. The modern scientific schoolmaster pursues him into the playground and makes him play at cricket because exercise is so good for the health. The modern Dr. Busby is a doctor of medicine as well as a doctor of divinity. He may say that the good of exercise is self-evident, but he must say it, and say it with authority. It cannot really be self-evident, or it never could have been compulsory. Think about that for a second. Anything that you have to require another person to believe or to do is not self-evident. But this is, in modern practice, a very mild case. In modern practice, the free educationists forbid far more things than the old-fashioned educationists. A person with a taste for paradox, if any such shameless creature could exist, might with some plausibility maintain concerning all our expansion since the failure of Luther's frank paganism and its replacement by Calvin's Puritanism, that all this expansion has not been an expansion, but the closing in of a prison, so that less and less beautiful and humane things have been permitted. Now, I realize that our Calvinist conscience is recoiling at what Chesterton just said. Try to just still your troubled heart for a moment and peer past it at the point that he's making. His point is that medieval Christendom loved the good, beautiful, and true. And it was not the Reformation, I would argue. It was the Enlightenment, which was not enlightening to anyone. It made everyone stupider. That has made civilization, Western civilization, coarse. Not good, beautiful, and true, but bad, false, and ugly. Now, Chesterton obviously lays some of the blame at Luther's paganizing of the church. And the Puritans, Calvin's Puritans, which remember, in Chesterton's day are not the kind of Puritans that we want to own. We want to look at those Puritans and say, lo a me, these are not my people. I want to be a Puritan, not that kind of a Puritan, right? Who have no joy, who have no life, who have no consciousness of the transcendent whatsoever, right? Chesterton is reacting to the corruption of the Reformed tradition through theological liberalism. That's what he's seeing. Machen is saying the same kinds of things. Lewis, one generation later, is going to say the same kind of things. You don't have to be a Calvinist or a non-Calvinist to see this. You don't have to be a Protestant or a Roman Catholic to see this. You should just be able to see this as a Christian. That Western civilization has abandoned the good, the beautiful, and the true in favor of the bad, the ugly, and the false. It's not expansion. It's withdrawing. It's closing a prison, he says. The Puritans destroyed images. The rationalists forbade fairy tales. Count Tolstoy practically issued one of his papal encyclicals against music. And I have heard of modern educationists who forbid children to play with tin soldiers. I remember a meek little madman who came up to me at some socialist soiree or other and asked me to use my influence. Have I any influence? against adventure stories for boys. Did they know who they were talking to? It seems they breed an appetite for blood. But never mind that. One must keep one's temper in the madhouse. I need only insist here that these things, even if a just deprivation, are a deprivation. I do not deny that the old vetoes and punishments were often idiotic and cruel, though they are much more so in a country like England, where in practice only a rich man decrees the punishment and only a poor man receives it, than in countries with a clearer popular tradition, such as Russia. In Russia, flogging is often inflicted by peasants on a peasant. In modern England, flogging can only in practice be inflicted by a gentleman on a very poor man. Thus, only a few days ago, as I write, a small boy, a son of the poor, of course, was sentenced to flogging and imprisonment for 5 years for having picked up a small piece of coal, which the experts value at 5 pennies. I am entirely on the side of such liberals and humanitarians as have protested against this almost bestial ignorance about boys. But I do think it a little unfair that these humanitarians, who excuse boys for being robbers, should denounce them for playing at robbers. I do think that those who understand a gutter snipe playing with a piece of coal might, by a sudden spurt of imagination, understand him playing with a tin soldier. To sum it up in one sentence, I think my meek little madman might have understood that there is many a boy who would rather be flogged and unjustly flogged than have his adventure story taken away. Now, what is Chesterton saying? There's this story, this news report about a little boy takes a piece of coal as he's playing, and he's charged with theft, and he's beaten, and he's imprisoned, and all of the liberals are up in arms. All of the humanitarians, oh, this is so inhumane, this is so awful, this is so egregious. And Chesterton says, that's right, that's true, it is awful, it's egregious, but you're the ones trying to take away his toys. He's playing with a piece of coal because you took away his soldiers. You're actually trying to take away his adventure stories. And you understand, in this case, well, he's just a boy. He is just a boy. What are you doing? What are you doing? He's pointing out the absurdity and inconsistency of even the true things that some of these socialist liberals might say. Chapter 7, the humility of Mrs. Grundy. In short, the new education is as harsh as the old, whether or no it is as high. The freest fad, as much as the strictest formula, is stiff with authority. It is because the humane father thinks soldiers are wrong that they are forbidden. There is no pretense, there can be no pretense that the boy would think so. The average boy's impression certainly would be simply this. If your father is a Methodist, you must not play with soldiers on Sunday. If your father is a socialist, you must not play with them even on weekdays. All educationists are utterly dogmatic and authoritarian. You cannot have free education. For if you left a child free, you would not educate him at all. Is there then no distinction or difference between the most hidebound conventionalists and the most brilliant and bizarre innovators? Is there no difference between the heaviest heavy father and the most reckless and speculative maiden aunt? Yes, there is. The difference is that the heavy father, in his heavy way, is a Democrat. Now, he's not talking about the Democrat Party that you know. He's talking about a person who is committed to the human tradition, not the oligarchy of elite socialists. You'll see that as he goes on. He does not urge a thing merely because to his fancy it should be done, but because, in his own admirable Republican formula, everybody does it. The conventional authority does claim some popular mandate. The unconventional authority does not. The Puritan who forbids soldiers on Sunday is at least expressing Puritan opinion, not merely his own opinion. He is not a despot. He is a democracy, a tyrannical democracy, a dingy and local democracy perhaps, but one that could do and has done the two ultimate virile things, fight and appeal to God. But the veto of the new educationists is like the veto of the House of Lords. It does not pretend to be representative. These innovators are always talking about the blushing modesty of Mrs. Grundy. I do not know whether Mrs. Grundy is more modest than they are, but I am sure she is more humble. But there is a further complication. The more anarchic, modern, may again attempt to escape the dilemma by saying that education should only be an enlargement of the mind, an opening of all the organs of receptivity. Light, he says, should be brought into darkness. Blinded and thwarted existences in all our ugly corners should merely be permitted to perceive and expand. In short, enlightenment should shed over darkest London. Now here is just the trouble, that insofar as this is involved, there is no darkest London. London is not dark at all, not even at night. We have said that if education is a solid substance, and there is none of it. We may now say that if education is an abstract expression, there is no lack of it. There is far too much of it. In fact, there is nothing else. There are no uneducated people. The socialist elites are trying to save men from being ignorant and uneducated and backward and traditional. There are no uneducated people. Everybody in England is educated. Only most people are educated wrong. The state schools were not the first schools, but among the last schools to be established. And London had been educating Londoners long before the London School Board. The error is a highly practical one. It is persistently assumed that unless a child is civilized by the established schools, he must remain a barbarian. I wish he did. Every child in London becomes a highly civilized person. But here are so many different civilizations, most of them born tired. Anyone will tell you that the trouble with the poor is not so much that the old are still foolish, but rather that the young are already wise. Without going to school at all, the gutter boy would be educated. Without going to school at all, he would be overeducated. The real object of our schools should be not so much to suggest complexity as solely to restore simplicity. You will hear venerable idealists declare that we must make war on the ignorance of the poor. But indeed, we have rather to make war on their knowledge. Real educationists have to resist a kind of roaring cataract of culture. The truant is being taught all day. If the children do not look at the large letters in the spelling book, they need only walk outside and look at the large letters on the poster. If they do not care for the colored maps provided by the school, they can gape at the colored maps provided by the Daily Mail. If they tire of electricity, they can take to electric trams. If they are unmoved by music, they can take to drink. If they will not work so as to get a prize from their school, they may work to get a prize from Prizzy Bits. If they cannot learn enough about law and citizenship to please the teacher, they learn enough about them to avoid the policeman. If they will not learn history forwards from the right end in the history books, then they will learn it backwards from the wrong end in the party newspapers. And this is the tragedy of the whole affair. That the London poor, a particularly quick-witted and civilized class, learn everything tail foremost. Learn even what is right in the way of what is wrong. They do not see the first principles of law in a law book. They only see its last results in the police news. They do not see the truths of politics in a general survey. They only see the lies of politics at a general election. Do you understand the point? Come down to chapter 9. It's on your next page. Through all this chaos, then, we come back once more to our main conclusion. The true task of culture today is not a task of expansion, but very decidedly of selection and rejection. The educationist must find a creed and teach it. Even if it be not a theological creed, it must still be as fastidious and as firm as theology. In short, it must be orthodox. The teacher may think it antiquated to have to decide precisely between the faith of Calvin and of Laud, the faith of Aquinas and of Swedenborg, but he has to choose between the faith of Kipling and of Shaw, between the world of Blatchford and of General Booth. Call it, if you will, a narrow question, whether your child shall be brought up by the vicar or the minister or the popish priests. They say that nowadays the creeds are crumbling. I doubt it, but at least the sects are increasing. And education must now be sectarian education merely for practical purposes. Out of all this throng of theories, it must somehow select a theory. Out of all these thundering voices, it must manage to hear a voice. Out of all this awful and aching battle of blinding lights, without one shadow to give shape to them, it must manage somehow to trace and track a star. He's saying, you have to choose, because there is no neutrality. And if you do not teach your children what is good and true and beautiful, the world will teach them what is not. Your child will not be uneducated. They will be alternatively educated. They will be taught to believe and to pursue things that will horrify you. There is no neutrality. Your responsibility is to bring your children up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord, and that without apology. And if they reject that when they go out on their own, that's between them and the Lord. But you have an obligation to pursue a decidedly dogmatic education. There is no education without dogma. There is no education without a creed. The question is whether it's going to be the creed of Christ or the creed of the demons. Okay? So, there's a lot more in that section, even that I printed out for you, and there's a lot more in that section of the book. I commend all of it to you. I wish that I could finish. The last section's hilarious. You can read it on your own. It's the Lord's Day. You can read Chesterton and enjoy him, but it's time for lunch. And so, Lord willing, remember, next week, some of you are going to be here at 8. Some of you are going to be here at 10:30. All of us can kind of pass by one another between 9:30 and 10:30. There'll be coffee and donuts out there, but we hope that this lets everybody get into the sanctuary, everybody be worshiping together, and we look forward to that. And Lord willing, we'll be able to have a time to have Sunday school again. Several of you have been asking about membership classes. The idea has been that we are going to do a membership class again, a large class, like we did about 7 years ago. We're figuring that out with this new schedule as well, but you can look forward to that. And if you're interested in that, just let the elders know, and we'll keep you updated. Okay?